nice introduction, and thanks a lot for everyone attending. It's my pleasure to present this work here. So this is joint work with Paul Shaver from University of Freiburg. At the time we wrote this paper together, and the topic here is, as in the title, we're looking at the interplay between terror events in the country of origin of refugees and their well-being in the country of residence, which is Germany in this case, and how this interplays also with family reunification options. So this is an empirical paper. And obviously, we will look at a very, so it's based on the research paper. We will look at a very narrow research question. But I want to start with the bigger picture we had in mind when we started this research. And please feel free to interrupt me if there are clarification questions. I'm happy to answer as we progress, and otherwise I think I will leave enough time in the end to discuss more substantive questions. I hope the presentation will allow for that. So the main the starting point of this project is the recent so-called refugee crisis in Europe, which was mostly driven by a peak in violence and especially terror activity, but also war activity in the main countries of origin, which are Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and to some lesser extent some African countries, and also Iran to some extent. So this is data from the World Global Terrorism Database. And as you can see here, there was a high jump in terror activity in the years 2014 to 2016-17, which coincides exactly with the period where we had also a peak in asylum applications in Europe. So this is data from the Eurostat, and this is mostly explains. So we already see here there's a strong correlation between violence in the country of origin and the arrival of refugees in Europe, and this is further confirmed with many surveys that ask for the main reasons, and it's also confirmed by the fact that most refugees received a positive reply on their asylum request because they could show that their lives were really in danger. So most of the refugees had a very tough life before migrating, and also a very tough life during the travel to Europe and to Germany in particular. Mostly via Turkey, using also smuggler services and very dangerous routes in some cases. So we can assume that arriving in a safe country such as Germany, where you have low levels of violence and relatively stable institutions, would in itself already increase the well-being of refugees dramatically. So I'm not really aware of a study showing this robustly, but I think this is an assumption we can make safely. So when we look at the life satisfaction levels, which I use as a proxy for well-being here in this study, we usually measure it on a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 is a very high life satisfaction and 0 is very low. And the average between life satisfaction between refugees and Germans tends to be relatively comparable, between 7 and 7.5. So this is interesting in the sense that on the one hand, of course, arriving in Germany, as I said, is probably contributes to really increase the life satisfaction of refugees. But on the other hand, they also suffer from a lot of psychological distress and mental health issues, which are consequences of the violence they experienced either directly or indirectly before or during migration. And there are a lot of studies also showing this. For example, a representative survey I checked just a few weeks ago estimated that about 40% of refugees suffer from at least minor psychological distress. So these numbers are much higher than the average German population. Moreover, the refugees have less access to health services. This is this is especially true in the when at arrival, in the first months of arrival, when they are making asylum requests. So in the process, they don't have full access to the health services. It's bureaucratic. They have to make requests. They have language barriers. They don't know exactly the system. And if on top you have some mental health issues, it's much more difficult. So this certainly contributes also to reduce their well-being. And we know that deteriorated health in general, and especially mental health, correlates strongly with and negatively with many aspects of social and economic integration. Persons who have a lower psychological health and well-being have also are more likely to be unemployed or out of the labor force, and also have less progress in terms of language acquisition and so on. So the question is, to what extent does the exposure of refugees that they experienced before migration in some sense, to what extent does it follow them in the destination country in Germany, which, even though there's no more a physical and directed threat, and the only remaining channel that's possible is the psychological effect. So there are many studies that showed both the physical and the psychological impact, which are dramatic, of terrorist attacks. And most of these studies focus on the people that were affected directly, mainly meaning people living in the places where the events happened. And here we have substantial literature also in psychology mostly, but also in other disciplines showing tremendous effects, but interestingly also relatively short-lived effects. And there are also some more macro papers that try to estimate the total well-being loss due to terrorism, which goes much beyond the physical cost of, which is estimated much higher than the physical cost. And focusing more on the population that is at the center of the study, refugees, they show a high prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and somatization. And there are many studies showing this, especially on studies in Turkey, and also studies in Germany show this. So this paints a relatively round picture. The question is whether these psychological effects of terrorism still, how long they hold, and whether they are reactivated with terrorist activities occurring in the country of origin. So that's the research question we ask in this paper. And we want to know whether terrorist activity in the country of origin still affects refugee well-being, even though they are far away. And especially here, we focus on the mechanism. So this is something we add to this literature, but we look much more closely at the mechanism here. And one of our main contributions is to show that terrorism still affects the well-being of people, even without direct exposure. And this is mostly due to psychological effects, we argue, and we show some evidence for that. In terms of methods, we use plausibly exogenous variation of terrorist activities in the days before the survey interview. So the study is based on a survey, and the interviews are conducted on different days. And there's basically we argue that there's no relationship between the day somebody is interviewed and the events that happen in the country of origin just before the interview. And we use this variation, which we argue is plausibly exogenous, to look at what effect these events have on the well-being, on the reported well-being of the person. Our main results can be summarized as follows. So we first show that fatalities due to terror events do indeed reduce the well-being of refugees in Germany, but the effects are very short-lived. So we find only effects for events that occurred 1 or 2 days before the interview. And we also show some suggestive evidence that the effect is via psychological distress. We also show that the effect is much stronger than comparable studies conducted on different populations. So, except for a small group of people, of refugees, that have their close relatives abroad, for this group, the effect is longer lived, but for the others, the effect is very short lived. So this is in a nutshell, these are the main results we will present. And this paper is related to a series of papers, very burgeoned literature on the effects of terror events on the local population, as I mentioned. So there are many papers exploiting very well-known events, such as the London bombings in 2005, September 11, of course, but also events in Israel. There are also papers looking more at the exposure of persons, and these papers all consistently show the very strong effect of terrorism on well-being, a negative effect, and also effects on mental health. Interestingly, most of these papers also show that the effect is relatively short-lived. So this is also consistent with what I will show in our paper. There are a few papers showing, studying something more in terms of study design close to what we do, which is Metcalfe and Kortos and Akay and Kortos. They studied the effect of terror events abroad, so in other countries, on people living. So Metcalfe is in the UK, and Akay et al. Combined data on 6 OECD countries. So they also show that there's an effect of terrorism events regardless of where they happen. They have also very measurable effects on well-being, but obviously these populations are less directly affected by the terror attacks than the population we study, because we focus on refugees who have probably be at least indirectly exposed to terrorism and might be more sensitive to reactivation effects. And as I mentioned, we also will look at in detail at the mechanism. So the study is based on the IAB-BAMF survey of refugees. So this is a survey started in 2016. It's based on a sample we draw from the federal statistics on aliens in Germany. And from this sample, we identified people who were most likely refugees, and were able to draw a representative sample for people who entered Germany between January 1st 2013 and January 1st, 2017. So this is the group of refugees that arrived en masse. It's about 1.2 million people in total over this period. And this is the group of refugees that is at the center of this survey. So it's a longitudinal survey annually, and in total there are about 7,000 households surveyed, plus household members, of course. So this, with appropriate weights, this survey can give us a pretty good idea of how integration is happening, but also how the refugees are doing in terms of well-being and other subjective measures of integration. So it's based on face-to-face interviews, and in this study we only focus on the first two waves conducted in 2016 and 17, and we only use the first interview of each person. So we don't use the panel dimension in this paper. So what types of variables do we use here? We have so the survey is really long. We have a lot of characteristics, but here we focus mostly on socio-demographic characteristics that we add as control variables in our study. And here we see, for example, that about 2/3 of the refugees who arrived during this period were male. And this is consistent also with a lot of other data that we can look at, for example, asylum requests, etc. The population is relatively young, with an average of 33 years. So we have mostly young male refugees, which is partly due to the fact that the routes to arrive to Germany were very difficult and risky. So this is something we also observe consistently in the data. And correspondingly, the health status of these refugees was relatively good. So this is the physical health status. So most 70% had a good or very good health status at the time of the survey. And consistent also with admin data, most refugees received a positive reply on their request for asylum. And keep in mind, these surveys are conducted mostly in 2016-17. By now, the percentages are much higher. But already then, there was a high share of positive replies on asylum requests, but also many were still in the asylum process. So there was still some uncertainty, which is also related to reduced well-being, as other studies have shown. And lastly, I just want to mention here the life satisfaction variable, which we use as a proxy for well-being. And here you see that the average was at 7.3, which is about, as I mentioned, comparable to what you find with similar measures for the German population in general. So in terms of composition of the sample we use here, it's mostly based on Syrians, which is the largest group of refugees arrived, followed by Iraq and Afghanistan. So these three countries are the main, basically the main countries of origin in the survey. And in total, we have 4,800 individuals for this analysis. The second data source we use is data on terror events in the countries of origin based on the global terrorism database. So this is a database collecting basically information on about 20,000 terror events during the period of time the window of time we look at here between June 2016 and March 2018. And we have data on 122 countries. So we identify the countries of origin of the refugees in our sample. And we use the number of people killed in each attack as a measure of the intensity of terrorist activity. But we obviously can also use different measures. So here's a quick overview of what's in this data. And so we have the number of events, and we already see here that in our sample of analysis, the countries of origin in our sample have many more events on average. So these are daily events on average than the full sample, if you want. So obviously these are the countries where most terror attacks occurred. Also in terms of fatality, it's 4 times higher. And we can decompose the events in terms of successful, unsuccessful events. We can see what type of method was used, and we can also see what was the target of the event. So all these pieces of information are documented in the global terror database. So we can observe terror attacks basically daily by country. And here is just a quick overview on the 4 main countries of origin in our sample, just to give you an idea what type of variation we are using. So here we see that we have a very different scale for each country. So in Syria, for example, this is monthly. We had on average about 200 fatalities per month due to terror attacks, but we have a lot of variation. And this varies even more if you look at it daily. And Afghanistan, the scale is higher with an average of 500 fatalities, and it's much lower in Iran, for example. But I will discuss this later in our methodological part. We use only variation within country. We don't compare across countries. Also for well-being measurement, I think this is important. And so in terms of estimation, what we do is we estimate a linear regression model where we basically look at, as I discussed previously, the number of terror fatalities that occurred in a certain window of time before the interview. So we vary this window. I will show you the detailed results. And in our main specifications, we use the numbers that occurred 1 or 2 days before the interview. But we can also go further back. And then we also control for the individual control variables I showed you, mostly socio-demographic characteristics that are likely to also be important determinants of well-being. So it's important to adjust for them. We also have, as I showed you, information on the migration status, the refugees claim, but also on health measures and things like that. Importantly, we control for monthly fixed effects and country of origin fixed effects. So the country of origin fixed effects make sure that all the variation we use comes from comparing responses of individuals within countries. So this is important, as I mentioned previously, because on the one hand, the terror events are on different scales. So this basically takes out the mean. And on the other hand, I think that the well-being question might also be answered differently, by depending on the cultural background. People might understand the question differently and give different answers. So we don't want to have these differences in scale, but we argue that within a country where we could presume that the understanding of the question would be more comparable, the variation would give us some information that's useful. So that's the main information I wanted to give you on the type of analysis we are doing here. And there's still just to finish with this empirical strategy part. Basically, our analysis is relying on 2 assumptions. First, we are assuming that the refugees know about the events that happen in their country of origin, right? Because we could question these assumptions and say, okay, maybe German newspapers and television don't report on this. But what we did is to check, okay, is this how plausible is this assumption? And we look at a couple of variables in our data set that suggest that refugees are still feeling strongly attached to their country of origin, which you can see here in the first question. And we also have we also see that most refugees have access to the internet, which is also consistent with anecdotal evidence and other studies that show that most refugees communicate via especially during the travel, but also after, communicate with their people in their country of origin via social media. And most refugees also report that they have contacts with persons in their country of origin at least once a week or daily. And they also declare that they consume media from their country of origin. So taken together, these descriptive statistics give us a bit more confidence that this assumption we are making is relatively plausible. The second assumption we are making is that the events happening in the country of origin have nothing to do with the timing of the interview. And of course, we could question this and say, okay, maybe if some dramatic event happened in the country of origin, the person might reschedule the interview or things like that, which would, could introduce some bias in our estimates. So we verified this empirically, and so we look at the number of interviews by country of origin, and we see no correlation between the number of interviews in a month by country of origin per day, and the number of terror activities in the day preceding the interview. So this also gives us some confidence that these two important assumptions we are making are likely to be plausible. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you, Sekou, but I need a clarification.
Yes.
So T is the time when the survey is administered, and the survey is administered in Germany, right?
No, the surveys are administered in the language that the person speaks. So the surveys were administered in person. So surveyors were recruited and trained to speak in the language that the respondent feels most comfortable in. So mostly Arabic.
Right, but the survey takes place in Germany.
Yes.
So not in the country of origin.
No,
so
these are all refugees in Germany.
Right. So T is the time of the survey in Germany, and then the terrorist attack refers to various windows, of which the one that you deem relevant is 2 days before the interview.
Yes.
So basically, all the effect is through exposure to media, or to
exactly.
phones.
Yeah, that's what I was just discussing. So we are assuming that the refugees know about the events. We don't know exactly how they know about it, but as I showed, the suggestive evidence via social media that you would be aware if something dramatic happened in the country of origin, and they also consume some media from their country of origin. But I presume most of the information goes to either direct contact via phone calls or social media.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for interrupting, and I profit to remind that there are 10 minutes before the end. Thank you.
Sure. I will now go through the main results. I hope that the setting of the study is more clear now, and I will now show you the main results. So here is our main table of results, and this is the number of terror fatalities in the day before, and here 2 days before the interview, And here, this is the sum of these first two. And we find that the strongest effect is in the 2 days before the interview. When we extend the lag, we don't see any effect anymore. Like we checked T-3, 4, 5, etc. And we don't see any effect after 2 days. That's what I mentioned in the introduction. And here, this is the full specification with all control variables, month fixed effects, origin fixed effects, region fixed effects. But if you are concerned that the results might be driven by some confounding factors in the control variables, the results almost don't change if we introduce the control variables stepwise. So this is almost unnecessary to control for any other variables here. And so we do a number of robustness checks to make sure that we really genuinely are capturing the effect of terrorist attacks. So one check we do is to make sure that the effects of terror activities the next day don't have any effect, right? This is important to make this plausible, and this is exactly what we found. What we also discuss a lot is whether there could be some confounding other events happening, that would be parallel to terror attacks. And the literature shows that there's a strong correlation between, for example, natural disasters and terror events. But we find that at the daily level, so most studies show this at the annual level. And you could have a natural disaster and deterioration of conditions, and then a few months later, terror events. But at the daily level, we don't see that. And we also do the same for protests. We verify that the protests are not, so it's not a political protest driving the results. And when we control for these variables in our regressions, we also still have our main effect. We find a very strong effect of natural disasters on well-being, which is an interesting result in itself, I think. But this effect does not change anything in our main results here. So natural disasters and terrorist attacks both affect well-being, but they are not correlated, as I showed you before. And we also make sure that our results are not driven by one specific country of origin, because as I showed you, most observations are clustered in a few countries. When we drop Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Iran, we basically have the same, qualitatively the same type of results, although the coefficients vary substantially. And we also verify that it's really the events in the country of origin of the respondents that are driving the results, and not events in other countries. So here, basically, what we show is that events in, let's say, Afghanistan would not affect the well-being of refugees from Syria. Yeah. We also account for, we show that when we normalize for population size, we still have, so we can look at terror for per capita, for example. Our results still hold. So then we look at different types of events, and we find that mostly it's when we look at the number of events, we have no effect. And this is due to the fact that successful events reduce well-being, and unsuccessful events are associated with positive effects on well-being. So the two cancel each other, which we found interesting. But other than that, the type of attack, or then whether the attack was using bombings or assaults, whether it was targeting government or civilians, doesn't change anything. So there's no heterogeneity there. And then we also look at the potential mechanisms, and we use indicators for mental health indicators here. So we have the refugee health screener, we have the patient health questionnaire for the depression, and we have the mental scale component of the short form health survey. So these are screening devices that you can administer that have been tested by psychologists. So these are not diagnostics, but they are like early warnings. And we find consistently on the total score, we always find that the terror attacks affect the total score, but not all subcomponents necessarily. Interestingly, we have a very strong effect on the probability of saying that the person will experience a traumatic event. And for example, we have an effect on melancholy, but not, for example, on worrying in general and things like that. So I'm going quickly through this because they basically give us an indication of the mechanism, but the main effect is always on the total score, and we usually have this heterogeneity when we decompose the total score into subcomponents. We have the same here for the mental mental scale component of the mental component scale. Sorry. And last result I wanted to show you, which I hinted in the introduction, is that when we look at effects longer than 2 days, they are mostly observable for refugees who still have at least a partner or a child abroad, so members of the nuclear family. For the others, we don't see any effect beyond the 2 days, but for this specific subgroup, this is a group where we say, okay, this is a stronger indirect exposure, so they might worry for their relatives. And interestingly, we only observe this for asylum seekers whose request was not approved yet. So these are people who cannot bring their family members to Germany. The refugees whose request has been approved have the option to bring their family members, and we don't see the long-term effect for those. So this suggests that this reunification policy plays an important role in mediating the effect, the reactivating effect of terror events on the well-being of refugees. So that already brings me to the conclusion. Just to sum up quickly, we find a very short-lived effect of terror attacks in the country of origin on the well-being of refugees. And we find that it's really the brutality of the terror activity that affects the well-being. It's not the number of events, as I showed you, although the number of successful events has some effect, but it's very small compared to the effect of the brutality. So brutality measured in terms of number of fatalities. And we also find consistent effects on markers of negative emotions, which suggests that the well-being effect is driven by emotional distress. So finally, what can we take away from this? So first, it's we show that the family reunification or separation policies reinforce this effect. So this is something to take into account when, for example, dealing with providing health services to refugees. First, recently I saw, for example, a report on Afghan women who said that, okay, she experienced a lot of traumatic reactivation when the events in Afghanistan happened in August, and this is a time where they require extra attention and extra care in terms of mental health access to health services. So this is what I would conclude from this study, and I'm looking forward to your comments and discussion. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks a lot to you, Sekou, also for making my job as a chair very, very easy, as you finished pretty much on time. So I also thank you for such a rich and articulated research. The first one who raised is virtual, and no, this is just a warning that my hand is still up. So, any questions?
Sekou, I have a question, and
Yes.
I can perhaps get us started. I've been asking this a lot more generally. If an impact on well-being is relatively short-lived, how important should policymakers care about it? And so I'm wondering, and then I have an idea after this. So this isn't supposed to be taken as a criticism. How much should we care if the effect only lasts 2 days?
Yeah, so this is something we thought about a lot, and I would relate this to let's say the design of the study. This is a limit of the quantitative exercise we're doing here. Basically, what we can show here is that in a large representative sample, you have a systematic well-being response to terrorist attacks. What we cannot show is, let's say, because we draw on variation over time, right? So for the same individual, we observe each individual once. So we are comparing well-being levels of different refugees, and just looking at the difference based on their interview time and what happened. We are not looking at the same person, over time. And I think that this is important, because if you take out let's say you have on average a much lower well-being level among refugees. For example, we see this for Afghanistan. Their well-being level is lower than other countries. This would be averaged out with the country fixed effects. See what I mean? So we are looking here at, we are showing, okay, there's a clear relationship here, but we cannot, I wouldn't conclude from that you should dismiss it as just the effect is short-lived.
So if I may, you might say that the month/country effect is picking up, is accounting for the otherwise negative effect that would have been observed.
Exactly, it's absorbing a lot of the systematic differences that you have between countries.
So my thought is maybe what you could do to estimate the size of this more broadly, because we have something like 20,000 attacks. So you could accumulate this. So somebody is experiencing this sort of effect.
Yes.
Every month, every week, and then so you could add it up, and then you have a longer lasting impact.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we do. We basically use the cumulated effects here. We use the cumulated effects, but here this is cumulated over 2 weeks, right? And this is cumulated over 4 weeks. But the thing is, if you don't have an additional effect, like let's say you have an effect at the first event and the second event, and if you don't have an additional effect at every event, you wouldn't capture that in the data. So it's like maybe an habituation effect at some point.
Right, but you have each time new terrorist attack happens, right, there is a shock to well-being.
Yes, exactly.
And so then that person's shock, I'm trusting this right now and ignoring the controls for the moment. Their well-being is shocked for 2 days, but it's shocked, say, 10 times a year. And then, so you got 20 days of the year in which they experience lower well-being, and you could do a back of the envelope calculation. Just an idea, and I'm taking up a bit of time here, so I'll let anybody chime in if they have questions, and we could talk more if that makes sense.
Yep. Anyone else who would like to ask a question? But while people are thinking about, I kind of have a follow-up question related to what Kelsey was mentioning. Yes. And somewhat related. So the point is, Based on your reading of this literature, to what extent are subjective well-being measures, such as life satisfaction, good measures of people's well-being, of refugees' well-being? My problem is the following one. Basically, I'm trying to think, okay, how would I judge my well-being if I were a refugee? And I'm thinking that a good share of my well-being would be affected by the feeling that I made it.
Yes, exactly.
I survived.
Yeah.
And so I wonder to what extent these can actually provide a biased evaluation of their well-being.
So in my reading of the literature, the life satisfaction and social and well-being overall, they're remarkably stable at the individual level and also at the cross-country level. So usually you have small deviations following some events, and then the well-being level go back to the individual mean, right? This is what I observe. So that's why I think they are very good indicators to identify which types of events or which types of factors affect well-being, but they are not so good at tracing how long the effect lasts and how these effects how these well-being effects will be sustained over time. So if you take, for example, unemployment, you see that at the occurrence of unemployment, well-being decreases, but then the person might get used to a new situation, and even though the person is still unemployed, the well-being would go back up. So it would capture the unemployment shock, but it would not necessarily show you this same difference for over months or years. That's my understanding of this literature. So I would say it's a very good indicator for short-term shocks to well-being. But it needs to be complemented with other measures. And that's why we also focus here a lot on psychological measures of psychological distress, because this is this main mechanism we have in mind. So given that life satisfaction is very broad and it measures a lot of components. So as you mentioned, for example, a successful asylum application would definitely be a positive shock to well-being, and have a lot of things feeding into this variable. Yes, please.
Francisco, I don't know if you're
Yeah,
finished.
I see. Yeah, Kelsey, I see you raise your hand.
So this is broadly, I'm thinking again about the mechanisms and how long this lasts, really trying to wrap my head around it. So I think you said in the context that, refugees typically or very frequently experience negative mental health consequences,
Yes.
depression, PTSD. But you also said that a lot of times the effects are short-lived. So I'm wondering if I misheard, so it's the refugee experience or the experience from their home country and moving can have traumatic impacts. But the effect when you're in now say Germany, those effects are short-lived. Are we talking about two different things? So the effects of terror in your home country when you're already residing in Germany is short-lived, or is it both? That so maybe you can clarify. Did I make that clear?
The short-lived effects here refer only to the events, the terror events happening in the country of origin. But on the other hand, we know from many other studies that refugees have very high levels of prevalence of psychological distress and other mental health issues. And it's not clear to me exactly how the mental health, the permanent, mental health situation would translate into well-being. Because if we compare also their responses into the life satisfaction question, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's relatively close to the average we see in the German population. You know, and this is something we didn't study in detail in this paper, which I would find interesting also to better understand to what extent, like, can we decompose this well-being of refugees? On one hand, as Francesco mentioned, we can expect a very high jump in life satisfaction due to the fact that they made it to Germany. On the other hand, this could be, you know, a bit lowered by the mental health issues they have and the post-traumatic disorders some of them might have. And maybe these two cancel each other out so that the average is comparable to Germans. But this is just some speculation I'm making, and not, we didn't decompose it at that level. We only see that it's strongly correlated.
Right, that's helpful. So one of the groups you have here are the people who say they're re-experiencing a traumatic event.
Yes, it's one component of this refugee health screener.
So you could look at those who have said that they are re-experiencing a traumatic event and see if the impact of terror at home is greater for them.
Yes, this is what we see here. Like this is the dependent variable here is a dummy variable equal to 1 if the person replied positively to the question and 0 otherwise. And so the dependent variable is the probability of responding.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about splitting the sample. So looking at your main effect and say either using an interaction term or using separate samples.
Yes.
Because it could be that your main effect is actually largely driven by, say, these people, or that the main effect lasts longer. It doesn't die away in 2 days. But, you know, mostly I'm thinking this 2-day effect seems to be, and I recognize that some of that is controlled away by, say, month effects, et cetera. It seems to be too small for us to be thinking too much about. However, if it does contribute to a longer term effect, it does have negative health consequences, mental health consequences, you know, or it affects, let's say, voting behavior, for example. Yes. These guys aren't allowed to vote, but they have other, I don't know, let's say labor market outcomes, et cetera. And so, and then also, if the effect is largely driven by, you know, so heterogeneity, generally these people who are re-experiencing traumatic events, or the people who still have family at home, you said that the ones with partners or children at home. So if you remove them from the sample, is there still a main effect? It's another related question. So there's a few there. Sorry.
I see. So basically, what you suggest, if I understand correctly, is some mediation analysis, like decomposing the effect and looking how much of the effect goes to, for let's say, re-experiencing traumatic events, and how much is explained by other factors, right?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking that those people who re-experienced a traumatic event are inherently different than those people who did not re-experience a traumatic event. So somebody who had a traumatic event in their home country initially, you know, may still have PTSD, and so it's a quote different type of people, which is not strictly true, right? I mean, this is all a spectrum, you know, but and so that group may dominate the overall result.
Yeah, I see your point. So the heterogeneity analysis. So we didn't look at this. This is something we could look at. What we did is look by, you know, family composition, because what we had in mind was this. What matters is not only your own exposure, but exposure of your nuclear family, and there we see some heterogeneity. But you're suggesting to split the sample by these response variables. This is something we could do.
And then you might find that the relationship lasts much longer. And so if it lasts for a month, for example, sure, that could have a dramatic impact on interviews. influencing labor market outcomes.
That's possible. Like for the something for the family reunification options, we already see that we have stronger effects even from events that are older, and we could expect something similar depending on the responses here. That's a good suggestion. Thanks. But to
we are
complement, sorry. Yes.
We are past 6 p.m. I would just like to ask other people in the audience if they have questions, just to raise their hands so that we can give them the microphone. So please, Sekou, if you want to follow up.
No, I just wanted to mention a study in Denmark that did something very similar, but with administrative data of medical use of psychological support and services, and they also found a strong effect of the probability of receiving psychological treatment just after terror effects. So this is using completely different set of data where it's really about the access to service, but the story is very consistent with what we also find. So we cannot show that the people that that they went into treatment and that they were taken care of, but we have this other side of the story, and the two are complementary, I think. Going back to this question, that I mean, if after a traumatic event or reactivation, if they are taken care of, the effects might also, this might reduce the intensity of the effects over time.
Yep. So I do not see any other hands raised. In that case, I asked, I use my position to ask you still a question, because perhaps you mentioned it, I may have missed it, is if you account for the time since the refugee arrived in Germany in your estimates.
Yes,
because
we have a control variable for that, yes.
Okay.
Let me show you. So on average, so we have the time, we control for the duration of asylum process. So on average, the process lasted 10 months in our sample, and months since immigration, about 20 months on average.
Yes, and a standard deviation of 10 in one case and 13 in the other case. So you have people that have arrived a couple of months ago, and
Yes,
people that have arrived 2 or 3 years ago.
Exactly, there's heterogeneity there. So the sample was drawn to capture people who arrived between 2013 and 2017. But there are also people who end up in the sample that were there before, because we also interview the whole household. So if somebody lives with somebody, if a refugee lives with somebody who has been there before, who could also be a refugee. Some started arriving as early as 2008, I think.
So but you are controlling for this aspect in your regression?
Yes. We are controlling for also type of accommodation, for the employment status, all these variables that are known in the literature to affect the well-being.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you. This is a last call. If there are any questions or comments, suggestions. Otherwise, I would say that this concludes our today's seminar. And
thank you very much.
I wish to thank our speaker for being with us today and sharing his work. which, if I'm not mistaken, has been published on Word Development. Am I right?
Yes.
So we can read the paper in detail on a nice journal.
Yes, and so we will work on some follow-ups also, taking more into account the panel dimension, because now we have people who have been interviewed at least 4, 5, 6 times, and there we can do some more in-depth analysis and follow, the evolution of well-being individually, but also see more like the implications for the integration process.
Good, then good luck with your next study, and thanks again for being with us today, and wish you and all the participants a lovely evening, and I hope to see, if not all of you, at least some of you at our conference in June. So thank you, take care, stay safe.
Thanks a lot for the comments and for the attendance.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.